My name is Gerald Tucker. I was born September 30th, 1946. I was born in Elizabeth Hospital in Prairie Grove, Arkansas. My father was Robert Tucker. My mother was Helen Gibson Tucker.
And tell me about your mom.
Well, my mom was born in the house just down the street from where we lived, the old Gibson place. She was born in 1915. She never had a job outside the home. We always stayed home mom. And they got married in 1933, I believe it was, or 34. And she lived to be 92 years old.
And what about her parents? Who were her parents?
My mother's parents were Nettie and Robert Gibson. Grandma Gibson was, I think, born in 1890, and her maiden name was Anderson. She moved in with my grandfather's family when they got married and lived in that same house the rest of her life until she went to a nursing home.
And do you know who her parents were?
The first names, I don't know what her parents' names were, except the last name was Anderson.
Okay. Tell me about your father's family.
My dad's family came from Indiana in about 1918 or 19, moved to Oklahoma and then stayed there about 3 years, then moved to Arkansas and spent the rest of their life there. He lived over, I'd say, across the hill from where I grew up. His mother's name was Ethel Tucker. Slagle's her maiden name, and her father was Oliver Tucker.
Okay, and do you know their parents?
No, I think we have some records somewhere that have that, but I don't remember their names.
And tell me about your earliest memories of your mom.
Well, that would go back to when I was real small. One of the first things I remember on Saturdays, we always went to town to do grocery shopping and whatever they needed. My grandma made butter and sold butter at the local stores, and she would go with us most of the time when I was real young and sell the butter, and then we'd buy groceries and whatever other errands we had to do. Go back. Another early memory is when I first started school. I'd get off the school bus and sometimes I could smell the donuts cooking at the house. It was about 100 yards or so away from where I got off the bus, but I could always smell when the donuts were on.
You say you went to town. What town would you go to and what would you do when you got there?
Well, when we went to town on Saturdays, we first went to Prairie Grove, seemed like. The bank that they used was in Prairie Grove. The pharmacy was in Prairie Grove. And there was a Southern Mercantile. They would go there to buy some clothes. Then we'd always go to Fayetteville and stop at Aunt Cece's grocery store on the way into town, into Fayetteville. And that's where Grandma would sell some of the butter. And then we'd go on up on the square in Fayetteville and do whatever shopping they needed to do. I just kind of walked around. I didn't know exactly what they were doing most of the time.
And tell me about your earliest memories of your dad.
Well, when I was real little, Daddy was a farmer. He farmed. They had about 40 acres up on the hill from our house that he farmed. He raised corn and other crops. Corn is one I remember especially because I helped pick the corn when I was really small. And then when he was, I guess probably in about 1953 or 4, he started working as a carpenter. So then he quit the farming and gave up the lease on that 40 acres, and still had cattle and a horse, and did some farming at our place, but he also was a carpenter.
You talked a little about your family business, the farming and the carpentry, but tell me more about your family's business.
Well, the farming and the carpentry, that was the family business. I don't remember them ever selling any of the farm products after Daddy started the carpentry work. Later on, he became a foreman on a construction crew and did that the rest of his working life. But they kept the land. They had 40 acres down at the home place too, and he kept that for many years until he retired, or right before he retired. He started selling pieces off to people to build houses and that sort of thing.
What was your part in the family business, the farming and the carpentry? What would you do to help?
Well, what I did to help was stay out of the way most of the time. I helped a little bit on the farm, helped milk the cows some, but that was really kind of over before I got to the age where I could be much help. I did work with Daddy when he was a construction foreman. When I got up into high school and then college, worked in the summers with him, and was able to pay my way through college that way.
Tell me about your brother. Who is your brother, and what would you guys do?
Well, I had one brother, Gerald Tucker. He's 4 years older than I am, and we played a lot. We had a cousin, James, who was out at the house quite a bit. They tended to send me off to run errands when they wanted to play, so I would be out of the way. But then I had another cousin, Maury Hill, who lived down the road from us a little ways, and he was about my age. So we were closer to brothers in the way we interacted than Daryl and I were, really, because Daryl was older, and at that time 4 years made a big difference.
When you were a kid, what would you and Maury and your brother and cousin do for fun?
Well, with Maury, we did a lot of just playing with toys, tractors, and we had the little iron tractors that run around, steel tractors, and some farm equipment. We'd get out in the yard and make a mess of the yard by trying to excavate things. And then with Daryl, we'd build forts, and we had a place on our property. This is where James came into the picture. We were digging for gold at one time. We were looking for, we were digging inside of a little hillside, making a cave and trying to find some fool's gold, is really what it turned out to be. And that's when Daryl and James would get out there and start working on that, and they'd send me back to the house to get something, just to keep me out of the way mostly.
What would your parents and their friends do for fun when you were a kid?
Well, my parents and their friends visited a lot. We had the Lowe's and the Pools mostly, plus family that would get together and eat and just sit around and talk. We went fishing some. I can remember some times when we went on overnight fishing, run a trot line in the river, Illinois River, and camp all night, just run those trot lines. But that was that was mostly with the Lowe's and the Pools that we did that.
Where did your family attend church?
We attended church at the Highland Community Church, which is just up the hill from the house. That's where Mother and Daddy had gone to school when they were real young. Through the third grade, they went to school at the church, or it was a one-room school at that time. Then that consolidated with the Farmington school system, and then they finished and went on to Farmington to school and finished there.
What was it like going to church there? Who were some of the family? You've mentioned some, but who were some of the families you remember there and the friendships at the church?
Well, the main families that I remember that were there long term were the Pools and the Lows. The Pools had a daughter, Jenny, who was my age, so we ran around a lot together. And then the Lows had a girl, Patty, who was a year or so younger than me, between my age and Mari's age. She died when she was 16, though, of lupus. And then the Hills, Mari, my cousin and his family, they went to church up there most of that time. Of course, Grandma was there. Grandmother Tucker was in the church. She was my Sunday school teacher for most of my young years.
Let's talk about school. Where did you go to school and what was it like?
Well, I went to school at Farmington. At that time, Farmington, we had one class for each grade. So I went to school with the same group of kids, several of them, all the way through till we graduated. One of my aunts was a teacher at the school part of the time when I was, I guess, in junior high and high school. She was a elementary teacher. Aunt Beulah was part of that group. We had, one thing I always remember about school was in my first grade through probably the 5th or 6th grade, we had the best meals that you could get in a school. We had one of the kids that was in my class, Linda Sue Spears, her grandmother was one of the cooks, and Miss Davis was a cook. I can't remember. She didn't have any kids in the school, I don't think, but Miss Davis was one of the cooks. And they made wonderful, wonderful food for us. Like I say, everybody went to school, or we rode the school bus to school most of the time. Gerald finally got it to where he could drive, and I guess we never did have a car that we took to school, but I took the bus just about all the way through high school.
Who were some of the teachers that you remember at Farmington?
Well, first grade teacher was Miss Brown. She taught first grade there for, I don't know how long, many, many years though. And then she had a sister, Miss Beckett, who was my third grade teacher. In the second grade, I don't know exactly what all happened, but we had probably 4 or 5 teachers during that year. Some of them were substitutes. I think they kept getting pregnant, is really what happened, so we changed teachers a lot. 4th grade, I was not at Farmington, but then in the 5th grade, I was back, and Miss Penn was my teacher. Miss Penn had gone to school with my mother, so they had known each other all their lives. Then in high school, 6th grade is Miss I can't remember how to say her name. It's French, but she was the teacher in the 6th grade. Then in high school, we had or junior high and high school, we had several teachers because we changed classes. But the one I remember most is Mr. Johnson. We called him Red Dot Johnson because every time you'd do something wrong, he'd put a red dot in his record book. If you got too many red dots, you were in trouble. He was also the shop teacher too, but he taught civics and shop.
What about sports? Did you play any sports?
I played several sports. I played, when I was young, I played baseball primarily. Little League and Babe Ruth baseball. Then in school, I played baseball, basketball, ran track, and played football one year. We didn't have a football team very much or very long in that school. My brother his senior year was the first year that they had football. had played six-man football. By the time I got up there, they were up to eight-man football.
Tell me about your aunts. I know you had a couple aunts that you were close with in their family. What do you remember about them?
Well, my aunts and uncles, my dad had two sisters and one brother. My mother had two sisters and one brother. My dad's brother, Uncle Frank, never did, when I was young, he didn't live close to us. He lived up in Kansas with his family. Later, he moved back to Arkansas, and saw him quite a bit. He was in kind of bad health at that point. My Aunt Beulah was Daddy's oldest sister. She lived in Fayetteville, and we did a lot of visiting with her. We and Uncle Ray and Wanda Faye and Boyce, their kids. Then Aunt Dixie was the younger sister of Daddy, and Uncle Bill and Aunt Dixie had a son named James, which I mentioned earlier, and they lived in Fayetteville also. Then Aunt Thelma, who was Mari's mother, Aunt Thelma Hill, and Uncle Blaine lived just down the road from us. And then Aunt Wilkie and Uncle Cleo, again, lived in Fayetteville. So that was Mother's other sister. So we were, I mean, the whole crowd was really close. All the cousins played together and visited back and forth, and never knew who was really related to who. That was kind of a mixed up mess.
Tell me about, do you remember moving to Oregon and living in Tulsa and coming back, or were you too young?
No, I remember moving to Oregon. We were, it was 1955, or 54 or 55 when we moved out there. It was in the summertime, and the big thing I remember about that move was I had poison ivy on my feet when we left home. So I spent a lot of the time in an unair conditioned car with my feet hanging out the window just to keep them a little bit cool, driving across the country. We lived in Oregon. Daddy worked in construction, but it rained so much out there that he really couldn't have steady work. So we only stayed there about 6 months, and then we moved back to Arkansas, or to Oklahoma, to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And again, he worked in construction there for another 6 months. And I finished fourth grade in Tulsa, and then we moved back to the home place in Arkansas, and they stayed there until Mother sold the place in, 2005. So we had that place from, they first bought it in 43 or 42 and sold it in 2005.
When do you remember, what did you do after high school? Kind of tell me what happened after high school.
After high school, I went to University of Arkansas, majored in accounting because I had had a bookkeeping teacher in high school that I really liked, and decided accounting may be a good thing to do. So I was majored in accounting, got married after my sophomore year, and then we lived in Fayetteville. Phyllis and I lived in Fayetteville until I graduated. Graduated in 4 years. I didn't realize that some people actually went more than 4 years to college, but I really needed to get a job, so got my degree in accounting. We moved down to Shreveport right after I graduated, and I worked for Southwestern Electric Power Company down there for a few years as an accountant.
Tell me about your kids.
We had two kids. Dusty Laduska is her actual name. We adopted both of them. We got her in 1970, and then in 1976 Jeremy came along. He was also adopted. We got both of them when they were about 3 days old, straight from the hospital. It was private adoptions, and worked out fine. kind of a stressful time, but it worked out just fine.
And then what did you do after that? Eventually you moved and remarried. Talk about that.
We had been in Shreveport, let's see, we went down there in 1968 and then moved in 1972. 1972, we moved to Conway, Arkansas. I took a job with a school bus manufacturing company in Conway. Stayed there about a year, and then we moved to Fayetteville, and I worked for a company that had some grocery stores and also had a dairy. Worked there probably 9 months, and they closed the office, moved the operation up to Kansas City. So essentially I got laid off, and I did some work, consulting work for a few months, and then moved back down to Shreveport, back to the same job I'd had when I left there. We were there from 1974 to 1986, and then I took a job with a CPA firm in Marshall, Texas. I was there only about 3 months when I got a call and asked me if I would like to come down to Corpus Christi as controller of a utility company down there, Central Power and Light Company. And I made that move, and in the process, Phyllis and I got a divorce, and a year or so later, I married Marva. Marva Long was her name then. And we've been married for almost 31 years now. Let me add to that. I was in Corpus Christi as controller for about 3.5 years. Then we moved to New Jersey, and I worked for a company up there, a consulting firm in New Jersey for 3 years, and then struck out on my own to do consulting work, and did that for 20 years just by myself. And in the process, we moved back to the Dallas area, which we've been there ever since.
Let's go back to when you were a kid in the Highland community. What was it like growing up in Highland community when you were a kid? What were some of your routines? What was daily life like?
Well, of course, in the school year, we went to school and then come home and do chores and homework and play. In the Highland community, most of the people that we associated with were the ones I've mentioned earlier, the Lowe's and the Pools and family members. We had, on Sundays, every other Sunday we'd go to Grandma Gibson's house to have lunch. The opposite Sunday we'd go to Grandmother Tucker's and have lunch. And almost always somebody, Aunt Beulah or Aunt Dixie or some of the family would be out there, or all of them. And then at Grandma Gibson's, Aunt Wilkie and Uncle Cleo would nearly always be there on Sunday. I don't remember Aunt Thelma and them being there too much. I mean, occasionally they'd come up, but it was mostly Aunt Wilkie and Uncle Cleo.
If somebody who'd never met Robert Tucker said, "Tell me about your dad and exactly what he was like," what would you tell them?
Well, my dad was a hard-working guy, and I knew at the time that he was always helping people, but I learned at his funeral how much he had done that. I had several people come up and talk to me about things Daddy had done to help them that I never knew about. He also was, I guess, very loyal. He had been in the Navy when he was during World War II. Lived out in San Diego with my mother and Gerald. This was before I was born. But when he came back, like I say, he was a farmer for a while, and then went into the carpentry work. And one thing, and I can't remember what age this was, but I would go with him to union meetings up in Fayetteville sometimes. And I probably would have been in the 8 years old or 9 years old time frame when this happened. The union was going to call a strike, and Daddy said, well, I can't do that. I've got a family to take care of. So he quit the union, and that was an issue with his work life for a number of years, because when he went into as a foreman on a construction crew, he worked for a company that was non-union, Tune Construction, and worked for them and a successor of theirs for the rest of until he retired. But the union people, I don't think ever really forgave him for that. But I mean, he just, he couldn't see going out on strike and maybe getting a little bit out of it at some future point and not be able to support his family.
You mentioned that the people told at the funerals and things he did. Who are some of the people, and what are some of the examples, if you can remember them?
Well, I don't really remember the people, but some fella came up to me and told me about one time he had, he was having a hard time, and Daddy loaned him some money. I mean, I never knew that Daddy had done that. And another fella came up and just said that he was, I can't remember exactly what the details were, but something about some equipment he had or a condition he had that he just couldn't get things worked out. Daddy helped him with fixing whatever it was, and people really appreciated it. But like I say, Daddy never talked about that kind of stuff, so I didn't know what had happened.
If someone came to you and said, tell me about your mom, what kind of a person she was, what would you tell them?
Well, my mom was like I said earlier, she was a stay-at-home mother, always took care of us. We never, I know now that they didn't have very much money, but we never suffered for food or anything. I mean, we didn't have a lot of clothes. She made our shirts for a period of time, not when I got older, but we always had a couple of pair of jeans if we needed them, and she just made do. Mother had health issues that a lot of people I don't think knew about. When I was real small, she had migraine headaches. She had them since she was a teenager. And at that time, when she had a migraine headache, it would be a 2-day affair, at least 2 days. She'd be in bed, in a dark room, no noise, she just couldn't hardly stand it. And then she'd finally get to the point where she just threw up, and she would start getting better. And that one, I can remember when I was a real small kid, thinking about what it would be like when she died. Because I just knew at one of these times that she was not going to make it through one of those 2-day headaches. But she finally got some medication, probably when I was in junior high school, best I remember, that would get her over the headaches. But that meant that she had a headache every day. Every morning she'd wake up with a bad headache. She'd take her medicine, and she'd get sick enough to throw up, and then she'd start getting better. But and that went on until, I don't know, probably the mid to early 90s. I can't remember exactly when she got other medications that kind of alleviated those everyday headaches. Mara can remember, we got married in 1987, and she can remember Mother going through that every morning. But the other thing that she always did, she always had a big breakfast for us. Even if she had a headache that, she was getting over it, she would always cook bacon and eggs and sausage, sometimes biscuits and gravy every morning, which was a big memory of mine. And she was a good cook. Always a good cook.
Who do you remember? You mentioned some of the neighbors and family, but who all do you remember coming over to your home to visit? Some of the friends and family.
Well, I don't remember Aunt Thelma and Uncle Cleo coming to the house a lot. Of course, Grandma's house was right down the road from us, a couple hundred yards, and we saw them down there a lot. Aunt Thelma and Uncle Blaine and the kids would come up pretty often. Aunt Dixie and Aunt Beulah, their families would be there quite a bit. The Pools and the Lows would come over a lot. And our preacher at Highland, especially after I was probably 10 or 11 years old, were always professors or somebody from John Brown University over in Siloam Springs. And it was probably, I'm not sure exactly how far it is, 25, 30 miles over there. So when the preacher would come for Sunday morning service, they would just stay until the evening service. So either the Lowe's, the Pools, or us would have them come to the house, and wife or kids if they had them, and spend the afternoon, feed them, spend the afternoon, then we go to church that night. Those were the main ones. That family was a big deal back then.
I know one of the big traditions in Highland was the Christmas Eve service. Do you remember going to those? If you do, talk about them.
The Christmas Eve services at Highland were always a big deal. They went from, well, before I was born, they had the Christmas Eve service, and they didn't end those until right after Mother died. And it was always an interesting time. We would go out and cut down a Christmas tree, take it into the church, decorate it. I mean, that was kind of a project that the members of the church would take on. We always had bags of fruit and candy that we'd put together for all the kids. And people would come for the Christmas Eve service that weren't there other times. We always had a little program that we would put on. When I was little, I was always in the programs, and we'd sing, or I don't know, we had little plays that we'd put on. Boyce and some of them, Boyce Davis and some of them would come out and sing for some of the programs, especially later on when we got big. But it was always a big time. We had Santa Claus come in. Usually it was Uncle Bill. But it was a small church, but we'd crowd it up on Christmas Eve.
What are some other fond memories you have that you want to talk about or share?
Well, the other memories that I think about, especially with Mother and Daddy, is they never missed an athletic event that Daryl and I were in. Baseball games were a little bit harder for Daddy because some of them would start while he was still at work, but he'd always get there before the end of the game, seemed like. They always went to all the basketball games and football games when we played football. The track meets, I don't recall, I don't know if they were there or not, because we always went as a team and left as a team, so if Mother and Daddy were there, I might have missed them sometimes. But the baseball, basketball, and football, they were always there. And there were other people in the neighborhood. There was one fella who never had any kids in the school, but he never missed a basketball game probably for 40 years. I would tell you his name, but I can't remember it. Oh, Mr. Kamak, that's his name.
Were there other neighbors maybe that you hadn't mentioned before that you can remember?
Well, there were some neighbors. We didn't have really close neighbors at that time as far as distance. There were some people up the road past grandma's house that there were some that came back and forth. There was one family down the street though, or down the road, the Massey family, when I was real small. Dennis Massey, I can't remember his wife's name, but then they had a son named Dennis who was my age that we played a lot. But then they moved when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and we kind of lost track of them after several years.
If someone came to you and said about your parents, my favorite thing about my dad was, what would you tell them? How would you finish that sentence?
Well, my favorite thing about my dad was he was always there for us, always consistent with his discipline. I can only remember one time that he paddled me, but I also remember one time I ran away from him, but he caught me because I was just running in circles, and he grabbed my arm, and he wasn't going to let me get away without my punishment. But he was, I mean, never cruel at all, but he was firm. And Mother, I don't think I ever tried to give Mother any problems, because I knew that, I think it was because of the headaches. I just didn't want to add anything to her.
Well, if you had to say my favorite thing about my mother, what would you say?
Well, the favorite thing about Mother was probably be she always kept us fed. Always kept us fed real good. And like I said, she was a very good cook. Later years, her eyesight got to the point where she had a little bit trouble with that. But I mean, she was pleasant to be around all the time. But she was just my mother.